We have a few minutes now for questions, as we've done before, so if people would like to write those questions and have them brought forward, we'll be happy to get going with that. Gary, maybe I could have you come to the microphone for this, because we don't have all the panelists up at the moment. They will come up a little later after George's. But while we're getting one question up, I have one that I thought you might want to reflect on a little bit. And that is, in your view, as you've reconstructed and thought about all of the expansive use of psalms in these different situations, how were these psalms taught to people? What percentage of the population knew them? We have popular songs that we sing, that everyone will recognize, will pick up the innuendos. If someone says, America the Beautiful, all of a sudden you think of a whole tune without any further prompting. What do you think the widespread cultural awareness of these things were?
Well, that's a great question, and I'll stand up here stumped without an answer. I assume, let me introduce a word into your vocabulary. Scholars of religion use the word memetic. Memetic means you do what everybody else around you does, or you do what your parents do, right? Which is to say, you mime. So we have these texts of the Torah, but how did an ancient Israelite or an ancient Jew know what to do on the holiday of Passover, or the holiday of Sukkot, right? You just knew because you were part of a community. And I assume that was the case with the text that they knew as well. The number of copies of any particular composition were limited due to the physical difficulties of actually writing a text. You had to get either papyrus or parchment and ink and put it on, right? And so I think people just committed large materials to memory. It's been shown by cognitive scientists that music helps with the memory even more so. We remember lyrics to songs better than we remember, major oratory like the Gettysburg Address, except for the first line, which we all had to learn in third grade. I suspect that it was just something that when you lived in a community with an ongoing tradition, you just knew it. I think that's probably the best answer that I can give.
I used America the Beautiful as an example, but in the Mishnah, where they are referring to these psalms, as you said, just the first line is the way, or kind of the title that they're using. When Jesus on the cross says, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" That's the first line of Psalm 22. Would the implication there be that Jesus was wanting to invoke the entire psalm as a part of his reference there?
Another great question from the learned Professor Welch, right? Okay. I know what I'm going to say to him, okay? Eine gute Frage gibt eine halbe Antwort, right? The good question has half the answer. Right, so I never thought of that. In other words, did Jesus recite only those opening words, or was he able to recite the entire psalm from memory? I have no problem with him being able, even under most dire circumstances, to be able to recite an entire psalm from memory. I think that
we're
would
expecting people to understand,
or have the people pick up the beat with him. Beat's the wrong word there, of course. Yeah.
Well, speaking of the beat, we have a question about was there music that went with the psalms by the time they start using all of these instruments? Do you think that the information from the Hurrian text tells us that there were, actually scores of music, or music that was learned that went with them?
Right. So the Psalms include in their superscriptions in particular, I use the word superscription. It's the opening verse of a psalm. Some of them just say a Psalm of David. And, every once in a while there's a Psalm of somebody else, a Psalm of Moses, there's one Psalm of Solomon. And then, of course, you have the Psalms of the sons of Korach and so on. So those superscriptions occasionally give us a musical term, or words which we interpret to be musical terms. We're not sure that they are all musical terms. Then there's the word Selah, which peppers through the book of Psalms, and it occurs only in the book of Psalms, except for one attestation in Habakkuk chapter 3, which is a poem similar to a psalm. And that may have a musical sense to it. We simply don't know. We simply don't know the answer to that. And then different communities recite or sing the Psalms with different tunes, right? We don't know the answer to that either. So my family may sing Psalm 113 one way this coming Friday night, but our neighbors will be singing it a different way because they learned a different tune to it. And I guarantee you that if I were to start the first two words with the tune that I know, I learned from my parents and my children learned from me, that they would probably be able to pick it up in an instant as well, and that kind of memetic system that I was referring to. But there's just too much gray area here. The gray area is too generous. I'll only quote our colleague Lee Levine of the Hebrew University, who's fond of saying about the study of antiquity, all we have are islands of information in a sea of ignorance. Mm-hmm.
Well, here you might want to look at this. It raises a question about chronology. We have the Arad inscription,
Right.
And wondering if the presence of terminology there doesn't help us in knowing something about the dating of Chronicles and maybe the dating of the Psalms themselves.
Right, so the question asks very intelligently, since we have the word B'nai Korach in the Arad Astrakhan found right next to the Arad temple in an outpost in southern Judah, why does the reference to the B'nai Korach, the sons of Korach, in the book of Chronicles relevant to the more or less contemporary King Yehoshaphat have to be anachronistic? It doesn't. So if I didn't make the point clearly enough, I would say that, and now let me say this because I didn't say it in my talk, I would speculate a little bit here and go out on a limb and say that the use of psalms or hymns in general in temple ritual began outside the Jerusalem temple, right? If we have it in Bethel, as we know from Amos, and if we have it in Arad, assuming that the sons of Korach on that inscription refers to the same sons of Korach singers from the Bible. By the way, this is a sidebar to the sidebar, right? Korach, is not one of the great heroes from the book of Numbers. He's quite, vilified there, and yet his descendants are called we assume they're his descendants, are become Levitical singers. So it's not impossible, but I think there would have been a resistance in the Jerusalem temple, and it probably entered the Jerusalem temple only at a later time. I apologize that I'm not sure where my image about the Hezekiah passage from the book of Isaiah disappeared to. Which leads me to think about what the possibility that it was Hezekiah who introduced all sorts of things, people coming to the temple for Passover, as Dan said, and maybe psalmody in the temple as well. Again, too much ignorance and not enough islands of information.
But one last question leads directly off of that. If the rise of psalms is a popular kind of movement outside of the temple, would the use of music in the temple eventually be considered perhaps a negative or negative kind of popular, almost sacrilegious activity within the temple, kind of like having rock music in the synagogue today would?
Until you had the coda to that question, I was going to say I would hope not, which is to say, I'm sure there were a few curmudgeons, maybe amongst the Sadducees, who looked back to those texts of the Torah and said, "Look, there simply is no music in the temple," right? But I think that I'll use that word democratic again, or sort of the popular or populist movement. The voices of the congregational people, they wanted to do more than simply bring their goat or their sheep and hand it to the priest and then do nothing but watch, right? They did not want to be observers. They wanted to be participants. And the way that they were able to do that as non-priests was through the use of psalms in the temple rituals.
Good. Right. So Joan Baez and Peter, Paul, and Mary were right after all. Wonderful. Well, thanks. Join me in, once again, thanking Gary Rendsburg for a wonderful discussion. How informative that's been.